The temperature was precisely 15 degrees Celsius over the Gulf of Oman. It was 1:15 a.m. on February 28th. The vertical launch systems of the USS gravely cracked open. A Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missile erupted into the dark sky. It leveled out at exactly 50 feet above the water. Then another missile followed. And another. 12 missiles were soon skimming the waves at Mach 0.7. They flew through the blind spots of the coastal radar arrays. They were heading straight for the Iranian shoreline. The military commanders working for Mojtaba Khamenei had absolutely no warning. The first warhead struck the massive fuel storage tanks at the Bandar Abbas naval facility. A pillar of blinding white fire punched through the night. Moments later, another missile detonated inside the engine room of the Jamaran. The Jamaran was the absolute pride of the Iranian conventional fleet. The blast snapped the keel of the ship in half. The stern dragged underwater in less than 40 seconds. The sun eventually rose over the Persian Gulf. 9 massive Iranian warships were already sinking into the toxic mud. Fast forward exactly 39 days. Donald Trump stood at a podium and announced a ceasefire. The Pentagon released a staggering list of destroyed targets. They claimed the total eradication of 120 Iranian naval vessels. They bragged about sinking the entire diesel submarine fleet. They declared the 4th largest navy in the Middle East officially dead. This is the definitive autopsy of that military campaign. Now, stay with me here, because the truth is much darker than the official narrative. The headlines fed you a manufactured illusion. Every major news network repeated the exact same talking points. They broadcasted continuous drone footage of burning steel. They promised that the global supply chain was secure. Defense contractors watched their stock valuations explode overnight. The political elite celebrated a flawless tactical victory. Except, they were completely blind to the actual war. The story they sold you was a beautifully packaged lie. Mojtaba Khamenei watched his multi-million-dollar frigates burn to ash. He did not panic. He did not order a desperate counterattack. He simply allowed the American military to waste billions of dollars blowing up floating decoys. Those massive ships were nothing more than sacrificial lambs. The entire opening bombardment was a tactical misdirection orchestrated by the weaker opponent. To comprehend this catastrophic intelligence failure, you must rewind the clock. You have to look at the foundational architecture of the Iranian military machine. Iran never operated a single unified naval force. They built 2 entirely separate entities. The first was the Artesh. This was their conventional navy. It was a collection of aging Russian Kilo-class submarines and bloated corvettes. These ships existed solely for state propaganda. They looked highly intimidating on television broadcasts, but they were fundamentally useless in a modern asymmetric conflict. The diesel submarines were so loud that American sonar operators joked about tracking them from a hemisphere away. The second entity was the actual nightmare. It was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. The IRGCN operated with a ruthlessly different philosophy. They despised large vessels. They invested exclusively in speed and overwhelming volume. They built thousands of lightweight fiberglass attack boats. Each hull cost roughly $50,000 to manufacture. But each boat carried a lethal Zafar anti-ship cruise missile. Let that sink in. A $50,000 piece of plastic could cripple a billion-dollar destroyer. This strategy was not an accident. It was born out of profound humiliation and decades of observation. Iran watched the Pentagon conduct the Millennium Challenge war games in 2002. They watched a retired American general use swarms of cheap boats to sink a simulated carrier strike group. The U.S. military establishment was so embarrassed by that defeat that they rigged the simulation to win. They forced the simulation to restart with new rules that protected the expensive warships. But the strategists operating under Mojtaba Khamenei never forgot that original lesson. They spent the next 24 years building an autonomous denial zone. They rigged the Strait of Hormuz with thousands of Maham 3 acoustic mines. These influence mines lay completely dormant on the seafloor. They ignore the acoustic signatures of cheap wooden dhows. They only detonate when they hear the specific cavitation profile of an American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. They rigged commercial drones with scavenged motorcycle parts and high explosives. They knew they could never defeat Donald Trump in a conventional gunfight. So they turned the Persian Gulf into a lethal math equation. They understood that a superpower will eventually bleed to death if it has to spend $5 million to intercept a threat that costs $5,000. That brings us to the actual mechanics of the ambush. because blowing up a ship in port is easy. Stopping a swarm of autonomous killers in open water is a completely different reality. Let me walk you through exactly how this works. The United States military did not just blindly fire missiles into the dark. They launched a devastating cyber offensive in the first 72 hours of the conflict. They completely blinded the early warning radar networks across the entire Iranian coastline. They severed the subterranean fiber optic cables connecting the coastal defense batteries. The military commanders reporting to Mojtaba Khamenei were completely isolated from their units. They were forced to coordinate a massive defensive war using overloaded civilian cellular towers. But here is the thing. The Iranian strategists had already planned for total communications failure decades ago. They did not rely on a centralized headquarters to give orders. They relied on decentralized and localized chaos. Before the first Tomahawk missile even left the launch tube, over 1,000 attack boats were already hiding. They were tucked away in shallow coves and narrow inlets. They were disguised alongside rusted civilian fishing dhows. These composite vessels are practically microscopic on a modern radar screen. They move at terrifying speeds across the chaotic surface of the water. They only need a few minutes to swarm and intercept a massive commercial oil tanker. It gets genuinely complicated when you look at the underwater domain. The regime did not just rely on speedboats to choke the global economy. They deployed thousands of Mojtaba Khamenei acoustic influence mines. These are not the archaic spiked spheres you see in old war movies. These are autonomous denial systems that sleep silently on the muddy seafloor. They actively ignore the acoustic signatures of cheap wooden boats and dolphins. They are programmed to listen exclusively for the heavy cavitation profile of a massive warship or a commercial supertanker. They shoot a rocket-propelled warhead upward at over 200 feet per second. They punch directly through the weakest point of the hull, which leads directly to the second problem. This is where the entire technological hierarchy of modern warfare completely collapsed. The United States deployed their most advanced supersonic stealth aircraft, but an F-35 Lightning II is fundamentally useless in this specific scenario. It crosses the combat zone at blistering speeds high above the clouds. The pilot cannot physically differentiate between an armed hostile craft and a lost civilian boat. The massive Arleigh Burke-class destroyers like the USS Michael Murphy faced a brutal mathematical nightmare. They were forced to defend themselves with SM-6 interceptor missiles. A single SM-6 cost roughly $4 million to replace. They were firing these ultra-expensive weapons at fiberglass boats that cost less than a used Honda Civic. That is not a tactical victory. That is accelerated financial bleeding. So, the Pentagon had to make a desperate and humiliating decision. They pulled the A-10 Thunderbolt II out of the aircraft boneyards. This is an incredibly slow and heavily armored aircraft designed half a century ago to destroy Soviet tanks. It is basically a massive 30mm rotary cannon with wings attached to it. It costs less than $10,000 to shred a speedboat with a burst from that cannon. The financial ratio finally shifted back into the favor of the superpower. The Warthogs flew extremely low alongside AH-64E Apache attack helicopters. Then the USS Tripoli arrived in the theater of operations. This was an amphibious assault ship carrying 2,000 heavily armed Marines and a squadron of vertical takeoff fighters. The Marines bypassed the deadly coastal waters and the minefields entirely. They dropped from the sky in helicopters directly onto the contested island launch pads. They introduced a brutal physical variable that the military engineers under Mojtaba Khamenei had never anticipated. Pause here for a moment. You might be sitting at home thinking this geopolitical disaster does not concern you at all. You might think the tactical movements of the USS Tripoli are just distant headlines on a screen. Look at your grocery receipt from this morning. Look at the glowing numbers on your local gas pump. The American military campaign successfully destroyed the conventional Iranian fleet. But the Strait of Hormuz remains an absolute ghost town. Donald Trump stood in front of the press and declared a ceasefire. Yet over 800 colossal commercial cargo ships are currently anchored just outside the danger zone. They are absolutely paralyzed by the terror of unseen acoustic mines resting in the dark mud. Global maritime insurance syndicates in London are refusing to cover any vessels entering the Persian Gulf. Because of this silent and invisible blockade, the price of crude oil just shattered $140 a barrel. The cost of diesel fuel required to transport your food across the country has doubled in a month. A basic loaf of bread is up 18%. Heating your home this winter will completely drain your savings account. The global supply chain has been systematically weaponized against you. You are personally financing the consequences of this horrific war every single time you swipe your debit card. Donald Trump sits at a heavily carved mahogany geopolitical table. He is sweating profusely. He is frantically pushing massive stacks of billion-dollar chips onto the board just to clear a single narrow waterway. Right across from him sits Mojtaba Khamenei. Khamenei is calmly sliding cheap plastic chips across the exact same table. He is methodically bleeding the American economy dry without breaking a sweat. But the room is much larger than just the two of them. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are standing silently in the shadows behind that exact same table. Xi Jinping is quietly holding an empty bag. He is aggressively catching every single piece of global influence that slips through the trembling fingers of the American president. While the United States military incinerates its wealth against cheap fiberglass boats, Xi Jinping is quietly exploiting the systemic chaos. Every single dollar the Pentagon burns in the Persian Gulf is a dollar they cannot spend defending the Pacific. Xi Jinping watches Trump desperately move massive assets like the USS Abraham Lincoln into the danger zone. He simply smiles. He aggressively buys up heavily discounted crude oil from the sanctioned black market. He is simultaneously finalizing massive currency swap agreements with Saudi Arabia as we speak. He is aggressively pushing the petro-yuan to permanently replace the petrodollar. Because Xi Jinping knows perfectly well that an American military bogged down in the Middle East cannot enforce global dollar hegemony. Vladimir Putin is also watching this devastating spectacle. Putin is eagerly watching the American defense industrial base completely exhaust its finite stockpile of advanced interceptors. Putin knows that every SM-6 missile fired at a rigged civilian drone in the Gulf of Oman is one less missile available to defend Eastern Europe. The global vultures are not directly participating in the violence. They are simply waiting in the dark to feast on the economic corpse. The manufactured illusion of absolute control shattered exactly 4 days ago. The United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth walked out of a highly classified Armed Services Committee hearing. He did not look like a man who had just secured a historic and decisive military victory. He did not confidently stroll out to his waiting armored motorcade. Instead, he quickly stepped into a heavily secured and isolated stairwell deep inside the Capitol building. He made a frantically encrypted 2-minute phone call. He was speaking directly to the CEO of Lockheed Martin, Jim Taiclet. He was desperately begging for an immediate emergency acceleration in the production of autonomous mine-clearing submersibles. That is absolutely not the calculated behavior of a global superpower in total control of the narrative. That is raw and unfiltered systemic panic. It is the terrifying realization that a decentralized fleet of expendable speedboats has fundamentally broken the maritime dominance of the United States. The panic is not strictly contained inside the Pentagon. It is heavily infecting Wall Street. Jamie Dimon recently held an emergency late-night briefing with the top energy analyst at JP Chase. They were staring at highly classified satellite imagery. The imagery showed the dormant Maham 3 acoustic mines resting silently in the mud off the coast of Bandar Abbas. They realized immediately that Lloyd's of London will never underwrite a commercial supertanker navigating those specific waters anytime soon. You cannot use a precision supersonic airstrike to change the mathematical risk assessment of a British insurance actuary. The realization that brute military force cannot lower insurance premiums sent absolute shockwaves through the financial sector. Fear is the ultimate asymmetric weapon. Fear does not show up on a radar screen. Fear does not have a thermal signature. But fear has successfully paralyzed 20% of the global energy supply. The financial architecture of the entire world is being systematically rewritten. And you are entirely distracted by high-definition videos of exploding ships. So here is the ultimate choice you must make today. Are we currently witnessing a temporary logistical bottleneck that the United States Navy will eventually manage to violently resolve? Or are we watching the permanent and orchestrated collapse of American global maritime supremacy? Write bottleneck or supremacy death in the comments down below. If you scroll down and see a comment that you violently disagree with, tell them exactly why they are walking completely blind into a catastrophic global depression. Leave your permanent mark on this video right now. Because exactly 6 months from today, when the price of everyday groceries absolutely shatters your personal budget again, you will desperately want a public record of exactly what you believed before the entire global supply chain permanently broke down.